meeting.
Sorry.
Okay, got it. Welcome to our WIN meeting. Welcome to our WIN meeting on the opening of the Front Line Against Apartheid, celebrating the 1973 strikes, which took place in the part of Durban, South Africa, which is KwaZulu-Natal area of South Africa. If you've heard of the King Shaka, that is the legacy of that area. But the workers of the 1973 strikes really put history on the map. They were in defiance of the wages. So today I am so proud to be sitting here on this chair, chairing this meeting and representing those workers, namely from my mother's era. My mother was one of those strikers that you heard about in this era. When she speaks about this moment, it is absolutely moving. The organization, the strategizing that took place, it was absolutely wonderful. I won't go into much of it because David obviously it was part of that era. He will tell us all about it. But in the spirit of the South African movement, I'm going to say, Amandla.
Amandla.
When I say Amandla, you say away too. Amandla.
Away.
Amandla.
Away.
Thank you. Take it on, David. Thank you.
Jabu, thanks for that marvelous introduction and for standing in for your mother at this time. We so wish we could have her talking and visible, but we know that she's not in good health. But we celebrate everything about her and her achievements and the workers' achievements at this time. 50 years is a long time, and not all of us have made it to this time. And we need to celebrate and rethink what we achieved then and what we've achieved now. Jabu, you mentioned the question of a living wage. That issue and the issues which were around the demands of the workers at that time are still very much alive today in South Africa. Our liberation is not complete. Now to go in, first of all, to give you a bit of an outline of what we are going to discuss. We're going to look at why Durban, the cheap labor system, how it worked, the Bantustans and collaborators, how Namibia opened the front line in Southern Africa, how in South Africa the strikes were the main force of the struggle, the stevedore Salwats and how they opened up the struggle in 1973, Sons Against the Fathers, that was apparently was a son, that was a term made about the young intellectuals at that time who fought against the system, why the 1973 strike movement opened up a social revolution in South Africa, how women gave the lead in struggle, the frame text strike of 1973, the unions rising through repression, and something of a roll call of honor for those that fought at that time. Now, why Durban? Durban, I think, as many critics have found, have said, is something of a sleepy center. But actually, if you scratch the surface and you go a little deeper into Durban's history, there's been a rich record of struggle. In the late 20s and early 30s, Durban became the storm center. They had to fly in troops and police from around South Africa to deal with the issue. It started to some extent by the rise of the Industrial Commercial Union of Africa, ICU. In a way, as you see it, it's the fact that I can see you. I can see you, white man. I can see you, capitalist. I can see what you're doing. In Durban, in the 1920s, workers refused to pay the poll tax. Remember, the poll tax had been forced on the workers in South Africa, as attempted in Britain, and they refused to hand over their receipts. Many were imprisoned. Champions is the man on the left-hand side. In the center is Clemens Kadali in this picture. A.W. Champion was someone I knew reasonably well. He was, well, not exactly the most militant fighter, but he did fight. His strategy was to have big rallies, to use lawyers, actually white lawyers, to win cases against the municipality and to organize entertainment, particularly a dance hall. Now, that doesn't seem particularly radical, but it did bring together, it did polarize Durban enormously. The dock workers acted independently of Champion. They organized their own strike. They actually fought with the police. In the end, that dance hall was burnt down. There was a huge confrontation. The Communist Party at that time intervened in Durban, developed a mass membership, and the police were forced to develop an underground and then started violently picking off individual communists in Durban, banishing them, forcing them out of Durban, and giving them, sentences. Now, to the to the right, you can see what a beautiful place Durban looked like in the 1930s. A lovely place to visit, and you can see the tourists there. If you look a little closely at those red buildings on the front there, those are the prison, that is the Durban Point Bastille. That's where forced labor was deployed in the 1920s, 30s. Many of those workers, well, it was all forced labor, were those that had been part of the Babata uprising in 1906 and 7. They were prisoner of war, and they were used to build the harbor. So that idyllic picture of a marvelous holiday covered up the desperate conditions on which African workers were living. ICU, you can see how the ICU had the center of its image, the eye itself, and unity is strength. That image has lasted in the South African history, and it became very popular in Durban itself. Now, based on the capitalist system in South Africa, until recently has been based on a cheap labor system. Well, people can say, well, everywhere in capitalism we have low wages. So what's this cheap labor system? Well, it's quite a lot more to it. And it's the basis of national and racial oppression in South Africa was this cheap labor system. It had these components. Black people had no right to urban housing. Some could get in, but that was only Section 10(1)A. The law allowed some people who were educated up to a certain level, who had a permanent job, and who in one way or other was already in the city to stay on. But for the rest, and that is the overwhelming majority of Black workers, it was short-term contract labor. The cities were defined as center of capital. No Black worker was allowed to just come in and set up a house and to start living in a family unit, because that would force up wages. Workers were held in barracks. I'll show you, here we are. This is the barracks that I saw in the 1960s and 70s, which housed the stevedoring labor, prison conditions for workers. The police controlled through the passes. A passes was your permit to be in an area or not. If you didn't have a permit, you'd be kicked out, put on a train, put on a bus, or just put into prison, and and sometimes ending up on the farms with no wage at all. And then the other element, which is not well known, is that the tribal authorities and the chiefs controlled labor through labor bureau. They'd be sent orders to send so many workers into town, and they would round up workers and send them in on a short-term contract. Now, Gatsho Buthelezi in the 1960s became the leader of the Zulu Bantustan, and this very place, the very prison conditions, this barrack here was managed by his uncle, J.B. Buthelezi. Now, that wasn't well known then. It was well known by the workers. There was a lot of confusion about it, but now I've found through going through the archives his testimony that he had fired so many workers, he'd maintained discipline, and that he'd given preference to the people from Mashlabatini, from where Buthelezi ruled. Now, we had collaborators. We had there here you see collaboration in action. That's Steve Buthelezi hanging in with Kissinger in the 1970s. And on the right, these are the conditions which I saw myself in June 1973 in the deep rural areas of KwaZulu-Natal, conditions which are absolutely horrific, based on migrant labor, when the men were allowed into the cities, but only for a short time, women not allowed at all at that time, and under the most incredible conditions of poverty and destitution. The doctor in this hospital was quite courageous. He allowed those photographs to be taken. They were put into the press, and the apartheid system absolutely denied those pictures were taken in South Africa. They said they came from Nigeria. That is totally untrue, and they were forced to stand down, on that question. But the collaboration meant that the people like Buthelezi demanded more land, more land, more land. It sounded radical. It sounded fabulous in terms of a nationalist position. But every time he demanded more land, that meant more black people would be taken off white land and put into the black areas. A little bit more land would have been added to the Bantustans. So this was an iniquitous system, another aspect of that cheap labor system. Now, the struggle was one of Southern Africa. It wasn't just of South Africa. Today, we are very nationalist-minded, and we see South Africa as an entity, Namibia as another entity, Zimbabwe as another entity. Previously, all of this was one complete system of colonialism and imperialism ruled through the South African state. Namibia was a semi-colony, in fact, directly a colony, and later a semi-colony of South Africa. In December 1971, these workers here identified in the right, and I've identified them by name because in history now these names are vanishing, and they corresponded between each other from Walvis Bay, Windhoek, and throughout Tsumeb, and throughout the whole of Windhoek, all around a statement by the Bantu commissioner of that time. That is the ruler over black people in Windhoek. He said, contract labor is not slavery. Anyone can leave when you want. So the workers said, okay, it's Christmas time, we're all going home. And many of the workers left left Windhoek and Walvis Bay and headed back to Ovambaland, where the Bantu authorities, that is to say the traditional leaders, then waged war on them and beat them up in various ways. So the struggle in Namibia started as a struggle against the contract labor and therefore for independence. That struggle against contract labor has now been forgotten by SWAPO, which inherited this struggle. Just look at the accused. I mentioned that accused number one, Leonard Sam here, was actually in the South African language actually a colored person. So the struggle was not just a struggle against the contract labor system by migrant workers. It also spread as a general strike throughout the region. I was present in 1972, wrote up a report, and we had it reprinted in Durban. Now, coming back to South Africa, a critical moment in my life and in the development of the liberation movement and the workers' movement in particular. In 1969, well, let's say in the 1960s, everybody said that apartheid was an absolutely permanent system. It could never be overthrown, and that the workers were completely demoralized and that nothing could be done. I remember having this argument with some of the leading social scientists at that time on this very Sunday. This is Sunday, the 9th of April, 1969. And at that time, people said the only answer for South Africa is to expose this and that, to be able to write more liberal tracts and hope that there could be some change from the top. The headline in the newspapers at that time, this is Easter 1969, Durban docks are paralyzed. The working class, which was said to be defeated by the external movement and by most people in the interior, the liberals and the others said it was absolutely impossible to think of a workers' movement. It exploded right in the center of Durban and in the major port of South Africa and of Southern Africa. from there onwards, I gave up the work I was doing and started doing research on how to develop the labor movement in South Africa and take this forward. Just remember, at this time, Easter 1969, the ANC was in such a crisis that Chris Hani wrote a memorandum. This is a guerrilla leader, wrote a memorandum. The ANC in exile is in deep crisis, and as a result, a rot is set in. He accused the leadership of setting up their own businesses and pocketing the money, which was meant to be there for a guerrilla struggle. So what was happening is the exterior movement was paralyzed, interior movement, the workers' movement was taking off. Now, in South Africa, we had an extraordinary development in the sense, it's quite a contrast to the labor movement, well, let's say the trade union we see at the moment. You'll see on the right-hand side a person called Harriet Bolton, an extraordinary trade union leader. You don't really see someone quite of this character at this time. She was negotiating in 1971 for the garment workers in Durban, and she wrote up this wanted slave laborers at starvation wages. She wrote up all of this, went down to the local newspaper, and they said, we can't carry this. How are you going to pay for it? She said, I'll pay for it. I'll pay for it out of my own pocket. She said, no, you're not allowed to put in an advert into the newspaper, because it all has to go through the editorial board first before it can be published. She says, listen, I'm a trade unionist. You're typographers. You in your union. I'm appealing as a unionist to other unionists to do what I'm asking. They put it in as half a page. I think she paid for a quarter of a page. And that was what the bosses read in 1971 at their breakfast. And that's what the workers read as well. She called a mass meeting of 26,000 workers during working hours. The police were there. They tried to break it up. In the end, she said, no, it's completely legal. People are just coming out to have a meeting. There was a prosecution which followed. That sent ripples throughout Durban, complete defiance of the apartheid regime. And success. She'd gotten significant wage increases at that time, unheard of at that time. The Wages Commission, that was myself and other students, made contact with her, and she just gave us her car keys, said, if you're going to organize, here's my car, fill up down at petrol on my own account. All I want to know is, how many workers have you organized? Have you organized the unorganized? And that's how we kicked off in Durban. Now, you mentioned this term, sons against fathers. AWG champion, that was the union leader of the 1920s, was an old man when I met him in the 1970s. But when we spoke to him, he said, he was a man of some irony. And he said, I like you white boys. White boys. He said, you look like the boys in the army. Well, of course, as white boys, we all had to be in the army or you'd be in prison. So he was on the right track. But there was another element that we were determined not to let the army, we knew the military, and we were wanting to make sure that we would never let them rule us, and that the workers actually would rule in South Africa. We launched the Wages Commissions in 71. We gave evidence, but not just separately as white students. We mobilized workers. We went around to the factories and to the docks. We had a fantastic victory in June 1972. Where hundreds of workers marched out of the docks and went to the Department of Labor to demand higher wages. They were shocked at the numbers appearing. The collaborators spoke and said, no, give us a little bit of something. And the workers stood up and denounced all the collaborators and told them to sit down and shut up. It was unheard of in South Africa. And that led to a go slow. This is before the 73 strikes. A go slow in Durban and Cape Town, to demand, at that time, it was 18 Rand a week, which is not very, it seems trivial now, it was a lot then. And we developed the benefit fund, which had 10,000 members by 1973. And this research led to the exposure of British companies. So this is what the Wages Commission looked like. We produced these cyclo-styled pamphlets. Later on, we managed to hijack a printer and do a little better job. You'll see there a report on the Namibian strike in the 3rd issue. And then on the 5th issue, the mobilization of dock workers to speak. And there was on the right-hand side is the workers' newspaper, which continued thereafter. Now, in the strikes themselves, remember I said the dock workers had ignited the strikes. In 1972, they came out on strike. They showed workers what could be done. The Coronation brick workers got into the front pages of the newspapers, especially when they controlled the traffic themselves. They just marched into the streets. This is under apartheid, under a police regime. And they waved a red flag and stopped the traffic, and they marched down the streets of Durban. They refused to elect a leadership. In general, this is what's happened. The workers then demanded double the wage or treble the wage and improved conditions, and implicitly then wage recognition, union recognition, and the right to assemble. Rolling strikes spread throughout Durban and elsewhere. The picture here is of Coronation brick workers dancing down the streets. Now, this was something to see. On the left-hand side, this is the very center of Durban. At that time, the second largest city, and it still is the second largest city in South Africa, one of the white citadels, and there are workers marching and dancing, and just outside the post office and the railway station, and demanding their rights. And on the right-hand side, you'll see here the textile workers are coming out on strike. I can give you the names of those workers. The guy with that hat on is actually a Wiseman Mbali, an extraordinary radical worker who had a history of resisting the Bantu authorities from Ponderland, and a guerrilla fighter as well as a workers' leader. Then you see Rosina Piri with the Afro. She was a woman who actually did the training of women to get them on the looms. Every person she trained had to join the union. And then to the right, you can see Gugu Bayela, one of the women leaders who later became a union leader. So these, we'd not met them at this time. I didn't know who Wiseman was, but he soon came into our offices after the strikes, and we formed the textile union along with June Rose Nala and others in Durban itself. Now, what happened in the strikes? Remember, the strikes were spontaneous. All right, we'd done some workers' agitation, but spontaneous meant that it was not controlled by the ANC. It was not controlled by any agency. It was certainly not controlled by white students. It led on from one strike, led to the other. It was massive. No one had seen anything like this. The city center was occupied by workers under apartheid. It was unbelievable. It was continuous. For every day there was a new headline. It was non-violent. It was massive, powerful, but non-violent was something important, which I'll come to, and it was successful. The workers refused to elect leaders. They said they were going to be victimized. They knew that there would be. Collective bargaining was shouting. Employers would make an offer. The workers would shout it down. The workers emerged demanding the recognition of black trade unions. Unfortunately, the anti-apartheid movement in Britain, the ANC in exile, took no interest in this. All they wanted to stress was the issue of disinvestment. But strikes by South African workers were ignored internationally. But what of the Indian population? Young revolutionaries like Omar Bacha, you see him smiling here, was there embedded with a person who was Tizi Khumalo, a relative of Jabu's. And there's Wiseman behind him, Wiseman, the guerrilla leader. and other workers. Indian workers did not scab. And many of them, as you see on the right-hand side, took up sticks as African workers and came out on strike. Now, why did I mention they were non-violent? Well, this was a very important issue. Imagine if the police had to open fire with machine guns right in the city center of Durban. It would have been mayhem. They might well have shot whites as well as blacks. It would have brought the whole apartheid regime immediately into an existential crisis. The police were paralyzed. Here were these brutal bastards, the special militarized detachments that had been flown into Durban to bring it under control. And there they are looking bored and stupid. The Wage Commission did something more than agitation. It did research into the farm sector and found that many of those companies were British companies. Adam Raphael, a journalist for the Guardian, came to South Africa. He took this picture, which he's granted me to use permission. That woman is putting out the food that she's been given for a week. She was paid the equivalent of R1.20 a week. And then they said, oh, but we give her food and accommodation. That is the food that she had for an entire week. It was desperate poverty in the rural areas. Now, women, we mentioned the question of a social revolution. Well, in a sense, a struggle for a living wage is the opening aspect of a social revolution. The other aspects are the most oppressed sections of the working class coming out on strike. And not only just coming out on strike, but actually giving leadership. And here, these are women from Frame Tex, and they could have been from Afrotex, where June Rose was, and so forth. CWPM, I organized in the early 1970s. There was horrific abuse of women. The manager insisted himself on personally inspecting women who were reporting sick to themselves. He personally inspected a woman to see if she was menstruating sufficiently in a bad condition to be able to take sick leave. Unbelievable, absolute. It's almost too horrific to report. Wages were deducted if a worker came 10 minutes late. They were forced to stay outside for another 30 minutes, and that a whole hour would be deducted. No overtime. If it was a Friday night and it looked as though there'd be rain, he wanted the workers to stay and fix up the factory before leaving. They were not paid overtime. Sexual abuse was common. A social revolution shows the women in a leading role, seeing the benefits. They were the nucleus of the union and a nucleus of the activists. Frame Tex strike, I'll come back to that later. Now, in every strike and every major struggle, there's an enormous leap forward. On the other hand, we can hardly expect the regime to sit and accept that. So here we have the bannings. Now, bannings were something which is difficult to think of today, but in my case, I was declared a communist. They said, we've examined your record, we found you're a communist. Because you're a communist, we're going to ban you in terms of the Suppression of Communism Act. You are not allowed to join and be part of a union. You're not allowed to go anywhere near a union office. You're not allowed to write an article. Any meeting more than 2 people will be a criminal offense, and you get five years. It was a difficult situation because imagine we were hyperactive, and then suddenly you're forced into inactivity, but you're also forced into poverty. Because where are you going to earn a living now? The police are at the gates all the time. You're under permanent surveillance. Your family says, look, it's time to settle down. How about you earning something so that you can survive? A very difficult personal circumstance, and especially because in South Africa, unlike pre-revolutionary Russia, we didn't have an organized underground. We just had to survive as best we could, and there wasn't a clear sense of what the politics were once you were unable to work publicly. Now, the Wages Commission I mentioned did research on the farm areas, and here you see in The Guardian, Adam Raphael got a front page article here, and his pictures were carried. This caused a huge scandal in Britain among the liberal and even among some of the more conservative layers in the ruling strata. and there was a demand for a parliamentary inquiry. That parliamentary inquiry took place. Many of the great and the good were first forced to come there and to be able to say that they were paying staff. Of course, they denied it. They lied like hell. They tried to kill Guardian. The Guardian nearly went out of print in 1973 because of all the cases that were brought against it. And Adam Raphael, in an interview I did with him, said that it was touch and go whether the Guardian would have survived because it had exposed wages in South Africa. The anti-apartheid movement took no notice of this, unfortunately. They did not support the struggle for higher wages in South Africa. Instead, they said it just proves the need to disinvest. Once the ANC is in power, it'll increase wages. In other words, turn the struggle upside down. So what the struggle had achieved, it had been successful. It had demanded a living wage. It had demanded equal wages for women. In CWPM, in Smith and Nephew, it's still going. Women were paid a third less. It succeeded. The success was very important. Workers actually did get, they didn't get 2 times or 3 times what they were earning, but they got 20%. They got at least a substantial increase from that time. Even the white population was sympathetic to the strikes because when you saw that someone was earning R1 a week, it seemed horrific. And I'm told that the Frame group was run by Mr. Frame. He was ashamed to get out there in white society because they felt he was such a despicable person. The police were paralyzed. It raised the consciousness of workers enormously in terms of non-racial unions and being prepared to pay subscriptions and build the unions themselves. It exposed the apartheid labor conditions, but most of all, it started the breakup of the cheap labor system. Workers are no longer prepared to bring out their passbooks to be controlled as they pass. This pass laws began to break down. The Bantustans were exposed. Now, unfortunately, this did not lead on to, the full solidarity that we could have expected from Britain. In Ruskin College, which Jobu knows well, there was a pamphlet produced. It says that the unions would be permanently, practically impotent, that they were useless, that the union should not be supported, rather apartheid system should be crushed. A kind of silly argument, but very persuasive in the anti-apartheid movement. Money should go to the SACTU bureaucracy, not to support South African struggle. Martin Lagassick and myself put up an alternative argument that sanctions should be put against capital, solidarity with labor, and we should have a direct line, a direct telephonic line to open up British workers and South African workers. Now, we're coming to the end. I'm sorry I've gone a little long. Just look at this picture. You'll see 45 people present. This is at a place called Red Acres, one of the few places where we could actually have a non-racial meeting at that time. This was workers' education and progress. Now, just look at the arithmetic here. I count 3 white people. I count 3 colored or Indian people, maybe 4. And the rest, the majority, the labor movement was developing as a Black African movement. It has to be mentioned because we've been criticized, the labor movement, for being white-led and all the rest of it. It was true, the whites were in various forms of leadership, but why? Because the Black leadership was cut down and not allowed to take its position, and we fought to have a Black leadership in power. You can see here, at the top, there's Alec Irwin. He later became a Minister of Finance and actually carried out the World Bank program. Then you got Eddie Webster below him, a professor, still a professor of sociology, and many, many of the others who you see here. I won't go through all the names. I'll mention some below. Died in the struggle against apartheid, but not recognized today. And I want to recognize June Rose Nala on the left, marvelous woman. a woman who actually led the workers in Afritex, who fought against the employers so much that they were scared of her. Can you believe it? These white creatures being scared or being told off by Junro. She was a toughie. And then we have in the center Alpheus and Tetra, one of the mildest, most pleasant, very courteous guy, but a determined struggler. He came from the generation, he was a young person in the SACTU who participated in SACTU in the 1950s and 60s. His name has not been mentioned in any history. Why? Because he worked in a movement which is actually fighting for labor, to build a labor movement in South Africa, and he associated with so-called heretical views such as that the workers in South Africa should take the leadership in the national struggle. And then most tragically, on the right-hand side, at least on my right-hand side, you can see here Becky, otherwise known as Harold Ngasana. He was a person also from the 1950s. He'd been a young person, imagine, at that time. He was persuaded to help with recruiting young guerrillas in exile. The police got him and beat the hell out of him. He was physically in a terrible shape. He was forced to make admissions. And the movement, that is not to say our movement, we accepted him back into the Union, but his name was defiled. He's not mentioned in any of the histories of the struggle of South Africa. And he was one of the leading works at the time. Now, why do we not see those names up now? Remember that these June Rose had been a general secretary. Alpheus Mthethwa had been a general secretary, but he was banned. And then Beck in Kasana was broken by the security police. I just want to move on to some general points now. Just look at this quote. I know we shouldn't just quote, but just think about it. The proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, rise to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself to be the nation. That is what we had achieved, at the beginning to achieve, in the 1970s. Unfortunately, that's not what we've been able to fulfill. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. I was going to ask you to just keep that big picture on with a lot of people, because I recognize so many people on that picture of the leaders. But before you even bring it up, I am so proud of you trying to keep this history alive. It's absolutely crucial. When we were at the Durban moment at the in January, there was so much conflict in terms of people trying to claim this history for themselves. And also, as you said, with the Ngasana and Tetwa and my mother, June Rose Nala, there is a deliberate act in South Africa to try and write these people of history. When I saw that big picture just now, I recognized so many people who were my mother's comrades. Mom is also there on the first line. You know, like I could, because I was a child, but I remember those faces because my mother took us to almost every sort of like big gathering. And even when she was detained, my grandmother dragged us all over Durban, going to speak to different people about my mother's plight at the time. So it's really, really crucial that this history it gets the recognition that it deserves. So I'm really, really proud of the stance that you've taken and the commitment that is there. Just to see Harriet Bolton, the woman that you showed earlier, who had that published that brave what you call advertisements for slaves for low wages. My mother speaks very highly of Harriet Bolton, her training in terms of her being a trade unionist, even to the point that she said sometimes when they finished work late, she would make sure that they stayed in her house. So there was a great comradeship that was forged by the white radicals were like working at the time with the black trade unionists who were not trade unions at the time, but because the black people weren't allowed to form what you call they were not recognized as trade unionists. So in the 70s, they really, they really mobilized in terms of those strikes and build really big movements, which today don't even recognize that struggle. So without further ado, I will invite people to make comments, and just a reminder that we are, we are comrades here. Let's be, have a nice debate in a comradely manner, and try and just keep the discussion like kind of really precise, so that when you have a spot, didn't take too long. Just all of us would like to have some some say in this. So if you just put your hands up, I will see them across the screen so that I can pick them up. And you have the hand function on your Zoom. If you want to speak, just put your hand up. Thank you very much. Okay, I can see Roger. Roger, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely amazing contribution. Thank you for the presentation, David. I learned a lot from it. I'm sure we all did. And it's a real vindication of the incredible persistence and revolutionary spirit of the working class, particularly in the most indescribably difficult conditions of semi-slavery. Now, in the notice for the meeting, quite correctly, it said not only that we're celebrating that struggle, but we're trying to discuss and learn the lessons of it. And I'd particularly be interested if David and other comrades who are here, particularly comrades who are joining us from South Africa, could begin to discuss and to focus on what happened to that incredible tradition, that heritage of militancy and of revolutionary aspirations, because we've seen very, very dark and very disturbing developments, the growth even of racism and communalism within South Africa. We've seen, of course, the absolute betrayals, the despair and demoralization that must have afflicted a whole generation. What are the prospects for a revival of those traditions today? That's my question.
Thank you, Roger. Can I take more hands, and then David, you can respond? Can I go to Dominic, Brian, and then to Steve Selt? Thanks.
Yeah, just to say there's two aspects that I'd just like to mention. I'll be very brief. The first one was of having no leaders. Well, this goes back to the mutinies that took place in the Royal Navy at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. When the sailors mutinied, demanding better conditions, they had what they called a round robin. So there was no head of the paper. They were all the same. They had a piece of paper with in a circular way, and everybody signed it in that circular way so that nobody could be picked off as being the leader. So workers do, if you like, faced with fights, find their own way of protecting, the people who have put themselves out. The other thing is that it's no surprise that, if you like, the most unorganized workers come to the fore in struggles because they're not bound by, if you like, the formulas and, if you like, conventions of organized workers, that they, are angry. And once having moved, they start demanding that you know that people listen to them. And the last thing I'd just like to say, there was a report, I'm not sure if it was on Al Jazeera or on one of the British news channels, that said that now South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world. You know, which shocked me, because in the 1970s I read a book about apartheid. It's from a capitalist point of view, but basically it underlined what David said, that South Africa governs Southern Africa, that South Africa at the time was, if you like, about 50% of all production in Africa was concentrated in South Africa. The countries like Nigeria and Egypt had small industrial bases, but South Africa was the powerhouse. This book went on to look at what it called realpolitik of South Africa developing, if you like, organised labour, or organised from their point of view, labour in Southern Africa, and bringing in migrant workers. You know, it was quite an interesting book. But to hear today that South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world is a real shocking condemnation of, if you like, the people, if you like, from 1973 who fought, and now we have a situation where people are living off the fat of the land and, you know, just totally ignoring the people who they should be representing. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dominic. Steve, please.
Yeah, well, I think it's been a very good contribution, but and the failure of the working class parties to build a workers' party in South Africa and in Namibia is a critical question. But I think we have to, more than just talk about the history, talk about what's going on now, because the privatization of national resources in South Africa and in Namibia is destroying the conditions of the working class and leading to the destruction of the unions by capitalist bosses, both European and Chinese. And I think one of the sharpest struggles is what's going on in Namibia. The Chinese government and private capitalists have taken over all the uranium mines, all the marble mines, and are basically on a union busting drive to kick out the union leaderships of these operations. So, and also they're attacking Comrade Haywood Bukes, who's a labor lawyer revolutionary in Namibia. And on the 19th, this coming Friday, there's going to be a hearing where they're going to try to put him in prison. They're going after him, take away his license and take away his land. They cut off his electricity and water. So we're organizing a day of action at the Chinese consulate in San Francisco. There is no Namibian consulate in San Francisco, but we're urging people around the world who want to support the South African and Namibian working class to go to the embassies and consulates, the Namibian embassy in London, and with a petition, and the union people and others demanding that they hands off Haywood and hands off of the miners, rehire the Rossing miners. So we in countries, advanced countries, have a responsibility to link up directly, not with talk, with action, in support of our brothers and sisters in Namibia and South Africa. So I'd urge people, and they're on the conference, the Zoom conference this today, to talk about that, because I mean, action is, I mean, you know, words are cheap, talk is cheap. What we have to have is action and solidarity with these brothers and sisters.
Thank you, Steve. I'll take Howard as well before he loses his thought process. Come in, Howard. Thank you. Howard Bukes.
Thank you. I think there were very important points raised by David. That is normally, as a rule, not mentioned in South African theoretical analysis of the situation. The role of the Bantustans, the role of the tribal hierarchies in the disciplining of the working class, the role of international capitalism, and the role of the anti-apartheid movement in not only disregarding but dissociating itself with the history of the working class and the demands in South Africa. I think that in a nutshell is what David was talking about. And I am very satisfied that this topic came up. I think what the paper that he delivered today should be published in a short form, because these are extremely important issues that he raised. The problem is that both in the whole southern region, southern African region, the working class history was not dissociated from bourgeois history, the forces that were promoting bourgeois history, and that was the absence of a proper class consciousness. In Russia and in Europe, there were very definite theoretical struggles around this question, and this was not so in Southern Africa when we come back to it. It is true that the leaders and heroes of the struggles of South African working class came from all national groups. There, in particular, there were many Jewish fighters who simply disappeared from the history books, who made enormous contributions to the struggle. The last point I just want to make is that at present, because of the absence of proper Marxist analysis of working class politics, there is a frightening rise of xenophobia and fascist ideologies in it. There's a new fellow, a sort of new kid on the block of the right-wing bourgeoisie, and that is a Mackenzie, who is preaching xenophobia, and which should be stopped in its tracks. The ANC and people like that are promoting a farcical situation typical of fascism. The foreign, so-called illegal foreigners in South Africa are 7% of the population. Unemployment is, official unemployment is 33%. They are blaming the 7% for unemployment in South Africa. The arithmetic does not even make sense, and that is the way that fascism operates. Hitler used the land of Goethe and of Beethoven to bring it down on its knees on this kind of rubbish that they preach. So in conclusion, it is of utter importance that this delivery of this speech be put to print and to be well distributed throughout South Africa. That's my contribution.
Thank you, Howard. I'm gonna go to David, and then I'll take your comments after George, because he's been waiting for a while. David, would you care to respond, please?
Great. Thanks for the warm reception. It means quite a lot to me. That's, really very much appreciated. But to answer some points, first of all, Jabu, look, I must pass this photograph to you. It's a historic photograph of great importance, because it's only by seeing the individual Black strike leaders and union leaders in these pictures that we bring them back to life. when they have been written out, well, not written out, they've just been erased from history. Honestly, I'm even shocked myself when I go through the various books. I could hold up the book I've just been reading of it's a history of the South African Communist Party, and it runs to something like 700 pages. And it mentions the 1973 strike just in passing as a mere a sub-clause in a sentence 3 times. I literally, I couldn't believe what I was reading. And everything else was, this comrade was here and that comrade was there, as though it actually made any sense. This is a mass movement which shattered the foundations of apartheid. Now that's what history needs to record, not the frivolous activities of someone in London saying this or that, or having some little network, here or there. These are the people who actually worked in the factories, fought in the factories, built the unions from nothing, collected money under the most adverse conditions, carried thousands of rand at that time, a fortune, without being touched by the criminals. We have a lot of criminals in South Africa. The criminals didn't want to touch a cent of the union money. They knew it just wasn't worth their life to even think of it. We built a movement of that immense reputation. And it's true that there were, we had white activists there and so forth. That was a technical division of labor of the time. I was privileged in a sense because of my white skin to be able to get into the university and then to be able to proceed. Black workers didn't have that opportunity. I had to use the develop of my intellect and the ability to be able to analyze stuff, to be able to read Marxism. By the way, we'd all read the Communist Manifesto, all the people up here, we'd read it. It's not as though we were ignorant. We'd supported the struggle in Vietnam. We had hoped to see the Americans driven out of Vietnam when the Tet Offensive. We stayed up all night to listen, to that. We opposed every imperious intervention, but we didn't believe that those aging creatures in the Soviet Union were anything to do with revolution. The idea was fatuous. It meant that the Communist Party assumed that we couldn't read. Everybody knew Solzhenitsyn, not that we believed Solzhenitsyn, but you had to read him. A day in the life of Ivan Ivanov, whatever, Roger will have to correct my pronunciation, was elementary reading. If you're a civilized person, if you're able to read, you'd have to read that. We knew all of that. We knew that they were selling out. We were trying to build out a leadership from below inside the country in an absolute political vacuum. In many ways, that heritage is still there. Roger said, well, look, in what way, does this come back to life? Well, I felt it when I came back to South Africa. I spent 4 months recently in South Africa. And within all the power blackouts and all the chaos, of current, regime in South Africa. Everywhere I went, I could show you some of the pictures. The workers wanted not only to know the history, but to know the future. Where are we going? What are we doing? Even people who were quite hostile politically to me came, and they knew my history. They knew I'd been expelled from the ANC and so forth, came to see me. People from Embo, that's the area in which I grew up as a young boy, and I knew people from there. And it's in the Valley of 1,000 Gold, the most unbelievably beautiful part of South Africa as a country. I was able to, when I spoke out at meetings, people came up and said, we know you, we remember you, we remember the fight that you put up, against the way in which workers were dismissed at that time, the struggle in the frame group and the textile factories. And we know that you're with us now in mass unemployment of women in the Valley of 1,000 Hills, a place which should bring joy to your eyes instead of that bringing tears. So all of those personal connections, it was marvelous. That spirit has not been quenched, but it has been diffused. It has been covered over by the tar of xenophobia, every excuse to avoid moving forward in a united manner, every breaking up of the ideas even of national liberation at a formal level, that we are one people of Southern Africa and of Africa, that our future is tied up by actually cooperation, coordination of the working people of the region, that our future is tied up with the liberation of women to make sure that they are not raped, abused, and killed, as is a common practice in South Africa, that we are united in all of this. Those are broad democratic social aspirations of the people. Only the working class represents that. Elsewhere, in every politician, every political group, there is a dismal degeneration beyond my belief. It's so shocked. I actually find it almost difficult to talk about and to develop. And then leaders, as in the past with Alec Erwin, denying every single thing about reaction of the 1970s, pretending it was all fine and that we're all doing well. I'm driven to fury, and the interesting thing is that when I am angry and I speak out, Black workers, even those who disagree with me, are coming up and shaking my hand and saying, "Thank God, someone's speaking out." We are the tendency. We are the group which can speak out and forcefully for the workers. We've got contacts in the dock workers and in the youth and in the movement in South Africa, among the educated, unemployed. We've got all kinds of possibilities. Our question is really how we bring that together to be able to unite struggling workers in Rossing mine, the Hewitts, terrible dilemmas, iniquitous dilemmas. We have a fine history of resistance. We have to just burnish that. We have to work again at that and bring it up to the surface and to organize. I like the reflection on the round robin. I didn't know all that. I knew of the round robin. I never knew where the round robin came from. Our workers are not stupid. We've learned a hell of a lot through struggle about how to keep our head down and then to raise it up again. How to organize in the rural areas and in the urban areas, how to turn migrancy to unite the struggle of rural people and of urban people, how to take advantage of the fact that workers are concentrated in compounds and barracks and even in prison as a way of developing new forms of resistance, and offering mainly a hope in all the despair and the dismal degeneration of society, that we actually are good people, that mankind is not inherently despotic and degenerate as we see it at the moment. We offer the hope for a society which is uniting Namibians, Zimbabweans, Mozambicans, all the fractions that colonization has left us with, uniting the working people with an internationalist perspective that we cannot on our own achieve socialism, but we can together make all these breakthroughs that I've described. Let me just stop there. I'm sorry I haven't answered every single point. I'm sure others could come in.
Thank you, David. Before I take more questions, I just wanted to comment on this picture, what it means for me to see this picture, because for me, it embattles me. It is where my politics as a young girl growing up was embedded in that picture. So I'm seeing a lot of people that I recognize in this picture, and I'm getting a bit emotional because some of them are no longer with us. I don't know if you can see my cursor moving around the picture. Can you see it? No, okay. I'm just going to say the bottom line where there's a couple of women. If you count 1, 2, 3, that's Begin Ngasana there, who David just spoke about, was really close to my mom. And next to him is my mother, June Rose Nala. I can't remember who this was, but before Begin Ngasana, I think that was Auntie Mbu from Lamontville. She's now I think she's now an advocate, a lawyer. Also, if you go up to the second line, where there's Oma Bacha next to Uncle Tizi, who's my grandmother's cousin. If you go down that picture, say one from Uncle Tizi, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's the lady that when I spoke to you about the Constitution in January, it's Auntie Mambisi from Claremont Township. Her mother was a big ANC supporter who was detained at some stage for Zuma, and they were tortured because they were accused of harboring President Zuma. And then if you go up again on the, I think it's the third line, the first man that's standing there wearing a suit, that's Uncle KD. They refer to him as Uncle KD Matanzima. I don't know why, but he was from the Transkei. He wasn't from Durban. And then if you go down towards like men who are wearing 3 shirts to the middle one, that's Uncle Jabu Gwala, who's now Jabu Ndobo. He's changed his surname, I don't know why. And then if you go to the next one, there's another lady called Bella Mahupane. That's the lady that I mentioned in January, was one of the leaders. And then I don't remember the rest, but those ones were sort of the pictures I picked up. It was a really, really like emotional time in terms of the time that they invested in making sure that the worker struggle was absolutely honored in terms of its commitment. When you talk about the wages, I remember a story that my mother told me about where she said she had collected all the subs from the unions and thousands of rands, and she went through, because they had no cars, she had to go through a public rank where they will take public transport. And she said whilst she was there with all this money, there were tsotsis. Tsotsis are people, they're referred to as tsotsis, but they're gangsters who rob people for money. And they decided to rob people on the who were waiting for transport. And my mom said, I was in so much fear that, oh my God, these people are going to take all the union money. How am I going to explain what happened to this union money? And she said, as the man was coming down the line, they getting people to give them money, take their watches off, whatever, that was robbing them off. Mom said, when it got to me, I don't know where she said she got the courage from, but she said, I started blasting him. I just started swearing at him. And she said, just that swearing got everybody that was on that line, let's just mobilize them into going for these men. And even, I think she said it was one Indian guy who, like, when she was swearing, walked straight to these tortoises and said, give me my watch back. And then the whole crowd started. And she said when she reported this to the union to say this had happened, and they were laughing, saying, oh, you should have just let them have it. My mom said, you wouldn't have been saying that if I hadn't come back with the money. So it was really, it was some really interesting stories. I just thought I'll share them, but I'm going to not take up too much time. I'm going to go to Care. Oh, what happened to George? You wanted to speak George, are you still here?
Yes, I'm still here.
Yes, do you still want to make your contribution before I go to Carol?
Yes, I just lowered my hand because you remembered that I was the next speaker. So if
Yes,
you give
okay.
me the opportunity, I'll still speak.
Okay, please.
Thank you very much, Comrade Jabu. My name is George Martin. I'm calling from Namibia. I'm part of the unlawfully dismissed mine workers at China Nuclear Nuclear Corporation, Rossing Uranium Limited. I would like to thank Comrade David for this very well presented presentation. It is with so much joy to listen to the courage our previous leaders had, and it is with great disappointment that I feel that leaders that have fought so hard are lost to history. They are not spoken of. And it's high time that the working class put their names back to the history that they deserve. We need to tell the workers the truth of who were the ones that brought liberation to this working class, because they are the founders of the union. Saying that, I would also like us, as the Africans or the Southern Africans, to come together in solidarity to fight these union bureaucracies, because these guys are in bed with the capitalists. They are the ones that are separating our struggles, and really we need to tie our struggles together so that the working class can be strengthened around Africa. That is just the contribution that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Solidarity. I'll go to Carol next, then to Finba, and then to Ian. Thank you.
First of all, I really want to thank David for this presentation and for, as George said, centering the working class, because it was just amazing that, you know, the working class has sort of dropped out of history. I just recently I'm on the international committee of my union, and I just recently went to a talk with Iranian women who have the view of multipolarity. You know, your enemy is my friend. And so when I raised the question of the working class there, it was poo-pooed. Like, the working class in the United States, first of all, we can't encourage the workers in Iran to rise up and mobilize because the United States is around there, and the American working class will never rise up. And so therefore, the best we can get is to support an anti-imperialist struggle against the United States, which means supporting the mullahs. So in the United States, I'm going to take this video and send it to people, because the New York City and many of the states in the United States are privatizing healthcare. And every time I argue to people who are involved in mobilizing against the privatization, they go, oh, you know, we're not allowed to strike. It's against the law. We'll never be able to do it. We have to go to the politicians. And I saw that people were like striking in the middle of apartheid, right? And putting their lives on the line like that. It was like, you're worried about the Taylor law in the United States where you might be fined? I mean, it was like crazy. So my thought was, I'm going to take this and send it to the groups of people who think that the only thing you can do is basically make deals with the politician and beg them to please do, you know, the right thing by opposing the privatization of healthcare. And, you know, we have to think of ourselves as internationalists, because we all are suffering from the same capitalist system, some more, some less. Obviously, I was in South Africa, and it was, when I spoke to people, everybody wanted to leave because they were so, you know, angry at the government, but didn't know what to do about it. So, you know, hopefully there'll be a real working class challenge, and David will be able to get this out to what's going on with the ANC, and they're thieving and they're demoralizing people about being able to make any real changes. But, you know, I think what we have to do is bring the message to the working class that the working class is powerful. And look what happened in South Africa and in Namibia, where people were out on the streets in the middle of this horrendous, horrible, fascistic system. And to some extent, we're able to beat back people. So we have to, I just want to close by saying that I hope our comrades in London will support the Namibian miners and Haywat and organize, you know, a demonstration in front of the Namibian embassy in support of our comrades, and really get people on board talking about internationalism and, you know, working class solidarity. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Carol. Finba?
Comrades, I want to begin by thanking David for a very inspiring and very, very informative contribution, and also Javu's contribution, which is also very informative and similarly inspiring. the first lesson that strikes me, and it was made clear in the contributions, is that it was the organized labor movement in South Africa that overthrew apartheid. It wasn't ended because of liberal interventions internationally. It was the organized working class that achieved it. And secondly, South Africa has always been an issue in the international labor movement. We mustn't lose sight of that. All over the world, people were demonstrating and fighting in various ways to overthrow apartheid in South Africa. In 1970, the Springbok South African team came to Ireland, the country where I live, to play a few games. There were big demonstrations there. I was on a couple of them myself. The Limerick Trades Council called a demonstration, Trades and Labour Council called a demonstration in Limerick when South Africa were playing against the Munster team. When they played Ireland in Dublin on the same weekend, I was up there at that, and that demonstration was called by the Dublin Council of Trade Unions. So the struggle has always been international, and across the world there have been interventions to assist the struggle in South Africa. Commerce will know that in Dublin, one of the trade unions, the Shop Workers and Distributive Workers Union, refused to handle goods from South Africa in accordance with the union's directive. As a result, they were sacked, and there's a protest outside this retail company, Dunn Stores, for a long, long time. Every single day, supporters of the struggle in South Africa mobilized. But I also want to make the point that even though we accept now that the labor movement is what achieved our goal, that wasn't accepted by the liberal middle-class leaders of the international anti-apartheid movement. In Dublin, the leader of the anti-apartheid struggle, a man called Kader Asmal, who later became a minister in the first South African government, and I spoke to him myself on this issue, he refused to share a platform with a man called Nimrod Sajaki, who was a man who struggled all his life from Johannesburg, struggled all his life against apartheid, was exiled, and lived in Ireland for a period, and we all got to know him, and he played a very good role. But Asmal refused to share a platform with him on the issue of South Africa. He was dismissed because Nimrod believed in the power of the labor movement, whereas Asmal and his likes thought that by liberal interventions and in international diplomacy, you could end South Africa, you could end apartheid. I think similarly, the struggle in South Africa is an inspiration to countries everywhere where the labor movement is pushed into the background. I'm thinking, for example, of the current situation in places such as Egypt, Iran, Brazil, the United States. The labor movement and the organized working class in particular will achieve the victories there. And the example in South Africa proves that and bears that point out, a reference to what Carol herself referred to earlier. The liberal diplomatic interventions will not resolve these questions in any of these countries. The working class has the power because they work at the point of production, and that's where their power comes from. The power to have in production, manufacture, transport, and commerce. That's where the power lies, and that's where the victories will be achieved. And that's the point that other comrades have mentioned as well, is the organized labor movement that will achieve these goals. And this is the lesson that is brought. And similarly, we need to go back to the fact that the struggle in South Africa is an international movement. Now, I can go back to 1970, a long, long time ago, from my earlier experience in fighting apartheid in Ireland, that is, or not fighting apartheid, fighting to raise the issue of fighting apartheid in other countries. So once again, thanks to David for a very inspiring and very informative contribution, and also to Jabu for filling out some of the experiences that she had and her mother had and other people had in South Africa. So thanks again, comrades.
Thank you, Finbar. I'll go to Ian next.
Hi, thank you, and apologies, my camera doesn't work, so you'll just have to deal with my voice. But it was a really incredible, inspiring presentation, David. Even though I was in transit for some of it across town, for everything that I could hear or half hear, it was absolutely inspiring. I hope it will be shared soon, not just for me to catch up with, but to share to a wider audience. I mean, this period of time, one of the things that made this one of the best meetings was how new everything was to me. This period of time, from more of a focus on the the purely political side of the struggle always seemed like the absolute desert crossing, or the nadir of it all, where not only were the guerrilla struggle smashed, as you mentioned, the ANC in prison, in exile, in a feeling like they were in a dead end, and all the distortions that came from that as well. It was interesting, the Chris Haney memorandum that you mentioned, but also the economy was booming. It was the height of grand apartheid under Vorster, who'd been imprisoned for Nazism in the Second World War. But by then, it was probably the height of apartheid South Africa's normalization and incorporation into capitalist Western society. And it looked like there was no obvious way out. It was a time that really reminded me. I've been thinking and acting a lot about Palestine this week on the 75th anniversary of the Nakba, with the Scotland Supports Palestine, a public meeting or two every night up here, plus demonstrations across Scotland and London and so on. And that particular period, roughly 1964 to 1976, reminds me of where we're at in the struggle against apartheid in Palestine now, or at least until recently, the kind of system of grand apartheid and putting the struggle in a box that Netanyahu was so good at in his previous term in office. Some of his associations in his current one are opening the whole thing up again, at least to scrutiny. But yeah, it wasn't just the Durban strike, but even before we got to that climax, really, really inspiring high level of struggle on the ground. And as I was saying, the way I saw things, it was more in 1976 with the Soweto uprising that things reopened in the struggle in South Africa itself. A couple of years earlier with the Portuguese Revolution and the emergence of new frontline states, the Cuban contribution, of course, in Angola, bogging down the apartheid army, Bota's total offensive and all that. But I was just wondering if after the Durban strike, if that fed into what happened in Soweto a few years later. I always kind of thought was what happened in Portugal and the colonies, and 74, 75 perhaps was what led to the start of it unraveling in South Africa in 76. But it seems like there were internal factors already there as well on the ground. I heard a little from David, more from some of the speakers since, about the kind of contradiction and, to me, baffling to an extent, because what they have to lose, attitude of some of the anti-apartheid forces of hostility to the workers' struggle. Later on, of course, it was the South African working class in the 80s, especially, building a new union movement that probably even more than the boycott or anything else, certainly more than anything military, brought apartheid down. So how was that kind of dispute resolved or overcome, or whatever, to get from that period to a period where there was the Labour anti-apartheid alliance that brought apartheid down, but obviously didn't fulfill many of the other demands of the workers, given the neoliberal turn. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Ian. Just gonna make a quick comment before I send it back to David, in terms of, say, your commentary around the 1976 struggle in relation to the consciousness that was propelled by the trade union, the organizing of strikes. I would definitely say that had a lot of impact, because these strikes were not only just focused on factories, but they were mobilizing in the townships. They were mobilizing people to join the strikes. People marched along the workers. And also it actually gave that impetus in terms of people recognizing that those that are working were not just working for themselves, they were working for their families. So families were affected by these wages. Families were, I mean, whenever I speak to my mother about this era, when she talks about the type of wages that they had to, that they were given, I said to her once, how did you survive? And my mother, because her mom was working as a nurse and my grandfather was a professional, she was able to survive, but she was just, when she was expressing the type of, stress that so many people were under, it was just heartbreaking. So I'm gonna take it back to David now. David, just to fill in, just to respond to the questions just said. Thank you, and the comments.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I wonder if I could just go back to a picture somewhere here. All right. This is one of the sons, that's me, addressing a mass meeting of strikers in Bolton Hall. And you'll see the signers up there wanted a living wage. Now, where did that come from? You see, I'm talking about the young trade unionists of the time, and Harriet Bolton as well, were reading what was happening in the British labor movement. We were vastly impressed by the shop stewards movement in the TNG, Transport and General Union, and by other shop stewards movements. We were reading critically to see what was going on. We saw the miners' strike. This is not the big miners' strike of the 1980s, but the strikes that had been taking place earlier. And we just took that slogan from the British miners' strike. I don't remember who put it up. We had a whole bunch of people, young students who were prepared to spend weekends or a whole week just working on building the unions. Now, that meant there was something particular going on in Durban. Where did we get that hall from? Harriet Bolton provided that hall. And he was quite happy to, have all the slogans. And for us to take over, these were not union members. These were unorganized workers, except this particular meeting here is of textile workers. And if you see, you can't see me too well, but I'm not smiling, mainly because I could see the union was in a terrible mess. This is not a union which had this was a union which had a history into the 1950s. And when I came into the leadership, it was like parachuted in, mainly because the union was in a state of collapse. The union secretary had just disappeared with all the money, every penny. The workers were coming in and begging me to give them back the money from the Christmas fund. Remember, this meeting's taking place in January, and they were meant to have had a Christmas parcel they'd been saving up. The general secretary had disappeared with that. This was a leader. I've never said this before, but this leader was on the ANC high command. He was going to be the person who would be part of a committee to run Durban if the revolution of attempted in the 1960s had been successful. And this was the depth of demoralization that was in the union. So I wasn't smiling. You'll see many other smiling faces because it was a happy time. Resistance, mass struggle, it puts a big smile on my face and most, except I was a little bit anxious because I knew we had no money. The Indian and African workers were terribly divided at that time because there was such cronyism and God knows what was going on in that union. I had to find out step by step. And then we started building from the base, starting basically with people like June Rose, African women organizing and putting the pressure on many of the older Indian workers. Remember, they were older workers. Younger Indian workers were getting better jobs, elsewhere, not in the textile industry. And then putting pressure on some of the older men who were just ravaged by defeats of the past and couldn't believe a new future was possible. It was women workers who inspired them and actually even bullied them. I remember going to one meeting in the late 1973, And the male workers were demanding, where's the union constitution? Is this union registered? Are you sure that's not going to be all going to be arrested the next day? I said, look, we are not registered. Our union constitution is right here if you want to read it. But there's no guarantee you won't be arrested. But women, are you prepared to join? Yes. I said, women, what should the men do? They must join. They must join. And that was the spirit of the June Rose Nalas and many of the other women in that picture. And that's why we put a smile back on our face when we struggled through repression. It's not nice being declared a banned person. You have to struggle to get everything, even to move from one place to the other. You have to go to the police station and telling them you're going from A to B. They're watching you, they're following you all the time. And actually, it's tough because you had brilliant ideas, you felt you had brilliant ideas, you were going to change the world, and suddenly you're struggling to get a penny or two together. So I just wanted to touch on then some bigger issues there. You see, we were, let's say the unions as a whole, were bumping up against, let's say the reactionary politics of the time. But no politician in South Africa and probably elsewhere, certainly no bourgeois politician and certainly no Stalinist politician ever tells you the truth. We didn't know what happened in the camps in 1969 with Chris Hani. We heard rumors, but we didn't want to believe those rumors. We didn't want to believe what the racists were saying. Even if it may or may not have been true, we didn't know. We believed, well, we didn't believe, but we were skeptical about someone called Buthelezi because he was part of the apartheid apparatus. But we didn't know that the ANC was talking to him from 1969, 70, 71, 72, 73, where he was being received in Washington as a son of Africa and given a meeting together with President Nixon and the like. We heard of that vaguely, but we didn't know at the same time he was also having mutual discussions with the ANC and that they were putting his speeches into their publications. The workers were telling us, the dock workers are saying, J.B. Buthelezi, he's our enemy. And that clarified so much. Politics is full of misinformation, of not knowing really what's going on, because no one will openly tell you what tricks they're up to and what deceptions they're trying to perform. All we knew was that these politicians did not support our struggle. That clarifies so much. And then the dock workers could say that this individual is appointing someone who's firing us. Wow, that clarifies enormously. So that there was all this clarification from a class perspective, which is the way of pushing a knife through all the disinformation and the confusion of that time. Buthelezi walked on water at that time. White people thought, well, this is the black savior because he's moderate, so-called moderate. He's non-violent. Actually, he was extremely violent. Anyway, I don't want to go on to that, but just remember that Buthelezi ended up killing something like 22,000 comrades, youth. And when I was in Durban, I raised this issue, and one of the leaders of the Communist Party said to me, how do you know? How do you know that happened? No one doubted that happened in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. But now they've accommodated themselves that even a person who's done such devastation, who's murdered their brothers and sisters, are prepared to pretend, oh, it actually was just an accident of history. Really, it was very confusing. They kept saying it's very complicated. You don't understand. You're just trying to oversimplify. There's no need to go into all of that. The people in SAMCOL and BTR, let me just touch on this. During this, there were heroic struggles in South Africa, which did get some support internationally. BTR, British, what was it, Tire and Rubber, BTR, or South Africa, it was called SAMCOL, outside of Pietermaritzburg. marvelous workers, absolutely inspiring, all part of our organization of that time. They came out on strike against this British company demanding union recognition. It got support from internationally, in Ireland, in Britain, in America, and elsewhere. The women workers were in the union came out and did a exhibition, well, actually it was a play called The Long March. And they came to Britain. Steve Zeltzer, was there and actually videoed, interviews with them, and including with Jabu, who was later assassinated in Carter. And then it developed, and there was a large amount of money collected, for the strike. Something on the order of 20 to 30,000 pounds collected in Ireland and elsewhere. Kader Asmal, and ANC representative and anti-apartheid representative, said that money must go to SACTU. It must not go to the workers in South Africa. Can you believe it? And those workers are so furious today that nobody can visit them and talk about solidarity. They've been so hurt by the brutalization, by the fact that the international labor movement didn't give a penny to their struggle when they were being killed by the apartheid system. It is beyond belief, except they have to know it because they got nothing. So there are terrible histories which are difficult to deal with because they've been made difficult, to deal with. The ANC has not given any support to those who fought and died, and the children of those who fought and died against the apartheid system, and particularly against the inquiry. There's no memorial, not a single word. No memorial, to those who fought in the Bambata Rebellion of 1906 and 7, and no memorial to those who fought in 1970s, and none of those comrades, youthful comrades who died fighting the apartheid system as exemplified by Buthelezis and Carter. So there's a lot of work, and it's difficult because they're all trying to confuse it and to say it is all too complicated to deal with. Apartheid was dead easy. It was white supremacy using black collaborators like the Bantustans to kill workers. It is that simple. Really, there's no complication in that one. So we want to rewrite history, not only by writing the books, and thank you for the encouragement, to put all this together, but rewrite history by changing social conditions, rewrite by creating and recreating the working class as it stood in the 1960s, 70s, and beyond. A magnificent history of resistance, and a resistance which is not which overcome the racism of the time. The multiracial also overcame multiracialism. Well, why do I mention multiracialism? Because the old idea of South Africa is, okay, we're all races, so let's add the whites and the coloreds and the Indians and the Africans into one sort of collage, and then it's okay, then we do something. Our idea was non-racialism, anti-racialism. That goes one step beyond. That is learning from Black consciousness, which said that we can unite across the racial division, not just by uniting A plus B plus C plus D, but actually uniting as individuals, as groups. But we wanted to add to that the idea of class. We are non-racial in that sense. A Black person talks to a white person, we have solidarity. This Indian worker talks to an African worker in solidarity. We are one class, we are one people in that in that way we reconstitute the nation. Now those we've advanced, but actually, as Roger has raised, the chauvinism, the xenophobia puts us back in the box of race. We wanted to escape, to break that collage, that prison of race, and to break out of it and to enter into a non-racial socialist world, which can really recreate South Africa from the terrible despotic conditions under British imperialism, all the imperialisms we've suffered, and the civil wars that we've also suffered, and to be able to raise people to a peaceful coexistence and development internationally.
Thank you so much, David, for that energetic response. It's like I say, it's incredible. It's embattling. It's also just the idea that a lot of the atrocities that have been committed are just being wiped out. I grew up as a child of the UDF, where there was a lot of infighting between Inkatha and UDF, and it was visible. And for people to come back and say that didn't take place, it's absolutely, it's discouraging, and it's almost like it's an atrocious crime against humanity for people to deny these things that they happen. And also this picture again, it's quite wonderful to see it, because I believe that's mom that's wearing the white we are talking to there in that picture, Junala. We have that picture at home. I'm going to go back to Steve Zelter. You want to comment?
Yeah, I was going to say that, I mean, it's very important that we're able to have this real international report from David about this history. And one of the advantageous things about technology, communication technology, is we can get these stories out and the truth out on an international level, including workers in 4 continents throughout the world. So that's a very positive thing, and we have to have more of these events of building international solidarity and getting the real history of the working class out. And the issue of the BTR strike, we organized in the United States for Sisters of the Long March, who came to Britain. I went there, videotaped, I interviewed Jabu and about their struggle. And I think that one of the hidden parts of this history in Southern Africa is that the AFL-CIO, as David was saying, supported Buthelezi and supported Inkatha. The CIA gave them $1 million to arm these thugs. And they gave Buthelezi an award, George Meany Award, at the AFL-CIO headquarters. And this issue within the labor movement in the United States is critical, because most workers have no idea about the role of the AFL-CIO, the CIA then in South Africa and today, because the Solidarity Center and the National Endowment for Democracy give $75 million a year for the international operations of the AFL-CIO. So the AFL-CIO openly supports imperialism, US imperialism, openly supports capitalism, and most workers in the United States are unaware of that. So part of the struggle that we have today, and we're going to be having an international conference on September the 10th in Washington, D.C., and then a protest at the AFL-CIO, is to demand accountability, to demand compensation to the many workers and their families who were killed as a direct result of the AFL-CIO and the CIA supporting Inkatha, and to bring that up in Washington and bring it up to the AFL-CIO, to the rank and file members of the unions, about this pernicious role of these bureaucrats who basically were collaborators with US imperialism in Southern Africa. And that's what we have to, that history is going to be brought forward. We have a group called Labor Education Project and AFL-CIO International Operations. We have a website to bring all this information together, because it's not just Southern Africa, it's Chile. This is the 50th anniversary of the coup in Chile, where thousands of trade unions were killed. And that was organized by the CIA with the support of the AFL-CIO leadership, actively in Chile. So there's a long, bloody history of US imperialism and the trade union bureaucracy of the AFL-CIO collaborating to overturn workers' movements on a global level. And that's why the support for the Namibian miners, as defense of Comrade Haywat, is important, because Namibia has an embassy in London, and it would be important on Friday, when Haywat's going to be having a hearing in Namibia, that there be an action at the embassy to let the Namibian government know that we're watching and we're against the effort to put him in prison and to fire these workers, to destroy the union movement. I mean, that's the other point I want to make. They're literally destroying the trade union movement in Namibia. They're firing all the union leaders in the marble mines, in the uranium mines. They're destroying the unions that were built against apartheid. And we can't not allow that. We have to make that an international issue. So I think that this history that David is going into is important, because that's an important part that people don't know about. But the struggle is today, right now, to defend the working class in Namibia and Southern Africa. And in Southern Africa, as we know, I was at the conference in January, massive unemployment, desperation, which is used by the capitalists, the ANC, the trade union bureaucrats, some of them, to whip up xenophobia and nationalist movements. Very dangerous. And this is happening all over the world. Of course, in the United States, xenophobia is ripped up by Trump and other right-wingers, and is not really fought by the unions. So it's an international issue, and I think we have an opportunity to build support for our brothers and sisters in South Africa and in concrete action today internationally.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to take it back to David to close, because we're getting closer to the time. I don't know if Roger wanted to say something before I hand it back to David.
No, but I think Comrade Ed will tell us about next week's meeting.
Okay, thank you. Comrade Ed, would you care to say something before I send it? I hand it back to David.
Okay, thank you. Next week's meeting is on the relationship between the United States and China, and what that implies for the future of capitalism in the world and the future of humanity. The comrades who follow the news in any way, shape or form will know that there is a conflict developing between the USA and China. Implicit in that conflict is the threat of war. The United States is still by far the biggest economic power on the globe, but it's been in gradual decline for the last 20 or 30 years relative to China, which was one of the most impoverished countries in the world in the middle of the 19th century. But in the middle, well, I mean, up until about 1950, in fact, in the middle of the 20th century. And now it is actually a rising power, a significant power, perhaps the second most important economy in the world after the United States. And we've seen in recent news items that there's all kinds of rivalry and naval maneuvers and sort of surveillance on the part of both China and the United States as to what's happening in the oceans around Taiwan and the Spratly Islands. China has developed the Belt and Road Project as part of its international effort to build itself as an economic power. And the war in Ukraine is perhaps just a little foretaste of a much bigger war that could emerge if the rivalry between China and the United States is not resolved by the working class coming to power and ending this capitalist system that causes such huge rivalry and conflict over world markets. This is the topic of the meeting next week, and I hope that comrades will be able to contribute, because trying to research it is so complicated that I'm sure I won't be able to say everything that there is to be said on the matter, and I welcome other comrades doing a bit of background reading to put some ideas into this complicated issue that we'll be talking about next week. That's it.
Thank you very much. Before I take it back to David, I want everybody to join me in shouting, "Long live the spirit of the 1973 strikes." Long live the spirit of the 1973 strikes. Long live.
Long live.
Long
Long
live.
live. Long live the spirit of
the 1972 strikes.
Long live.
Long live.
And 72.
Long live.
Let's not forget our
Yeah.
comrades that led us. You led us to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, look,
Thank
comrades,
you.
I can't really add much more, but let me try and add some song, which was the actual songs of the workers as they marched down the streets. I'll just see if it works this time.
It's
You
not.
have to, when you put the sharing on the screen, you have to touch the button says for the sound. So in other words, yeah. So when you go to sharing, you have to have, and before you go to the sharing, you have to touch the button that says you want to share the sound. It's on the left-hand side of the Zoom.
Okay.
Lower left-hand side.
Yeah.
It says sharing on the lower left-hand side, so you can share the sound that you're going to be uploading.
Well, I'm sorry, comrades, it didn't come through.
We need some young
oddly enough-
people with technical abilities.
Now, amazingly, I can hear it so much that it drowns out my voice now. But oddly, it's some AI thing because it doesn't actually come through. But anyway, comrades, can I just say that we'll rectify that in the future, just so that you can actually hear the sound of workers. It was too marvelous.
Send me the files. Send me the music files, David.
Sure.
I'll just send me the files, so the music files, and they can be edited into the video.
Okay, I'll do that. But thanks, comrades. I think we had a marvelous discussion. I'll pick up on all the points that have been made, and I'm quite reinvigorated to get the appreciation, the criticism, and the enthusiasm which I've heard today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye, comrades.
Thanks.